this is your first video lecture. So exciting. Oh my gosh. Hey, let's go ahead and continue our discussion from this afternoon or this morning or whenever the heck it was with our little minimum day. I'm going to minimize myself so you don't have to look at me like for the next half hour or so. So let me make myself small. Yay. Oh my goodness. People in Jamestown be like that. So remember, we talked about Jamestown and how they didn't do very well. Ultimately, it was failure, and the first winter time was known as the starving time, and so you have a situation when they're actually like all frozen, like bar, and they are basically resorting to cannibalism and eating each other up, num 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 num. And we all know that ultimately it's going to be tobacco that is going to save Jamestown. It's going to be John Rolfe that's going to bring tobacco seeds in. He's going to be like, I got tobacco, and he's going to plant those things, and that's what's going to transform Jamestown forever and ever. So then that brings us then to looking at the southern colonies. Now, the Chesapeake is the area that Jamestown was at. It's a region. I'll show you a map of that in a second. So we're going to be focusing on the Chesapeake region, which is actually part of the South. So the English settlement starts in Jamestown in the Chesapeake, and then it is going to basically encompass all the southern colonies. If you can see my little pointer here, going down, the Chesapeake is right where the pointer is, and then going all the way down. Now, keep in mind here that Florida is under Spanish control. So that's not one of the colonies we're going to be focusing on today, because the British, they're not going to get that until a little bit later. All right? So Chesapeake in the south. So here's a close-up map of the Chesapeake. So we have the Chesapeake Bay right here, and then here's Jamestown. So this is what we've been talking about. And because of tobacco, we're going to start to see expansion within the region and all throughout the Chesapeake area. And then we'll talk about Maryland a little bit, which will be really similar to Virginia. And then getting into the southern colonies of the Carolinas, which actually included Georgia at one point in time. But you can see the actual colonies themselves are, they look a little bit different than we would think of what they look like today. So geographically speaking, it's a little bit different. You can also see, going back to the Chesapeake, the Powhatan Indians and where they're located. And we talked about the Anglo-Powhatan Wars today also. Okay, so just a little bit of geography right there. Alright, so we've looked at the Virginia Company, and we know that the Virginia Company wasn't doing very well, and they weren't turning a profit, so of course the stockholders are not going to be too happy about that. We're going to find that King James isn't going to be too happy about that. You have the Indian situation going on. The colonists aren't just doing what they need to do, so we're going to find that the Virginia Company is going to have to kind of change some things up. Utilize that headright system a little bit more, get people out there, try to really start to turn that profit to be able to make both the stockholders and the king, at least somewhat decently happy. But again, it's not really gonna pan out how the Virginia Company actually anticipated. So tobacco will save the region. So like I said, that's when John Rolfe comes in, and he's going to bring in that method of planting tobacco that is going to allow Virginia to become a plantation society that is going to be completely built upon tobacco, and that's what's going to give the prosperity to the region that was necessary. But still, we're going to find James the First is still not going to be too happy. One of the reasons being because he was kind of a teetotaler for his time, in the sense that he did not support the idea of smoking tobacco. And remember, I said tobacco was something that people were, that was their drug during that time. They smoked it, they ate it, they snorted it, they slept with it. I don't know if they slept with it, but they really enjoyed the stuff. So because James was a little bit of a prude in that sense, that he didn't like the fact that you had all these people who were smoking this noxious weed, as he would call it. But you know what, let's be honest, I mean, he did like the revenue that came from it. But I think what he's going to want here is he's probably going to want a little bit more control over the situation. The Chesapeake does become the world's largest supplier of tobacco, and of course, remember with the theory of mercantilism that really the sole goal is going to be to enrich the mother country, to enrich Britain. It's not really necessarily about enriching the colonists. Okay, James doesn't really care, you know, a ton about that. What he really wants is this for England to profit from this more than anything else. So he may hate the idea of tobacco, morally speaking, but he's gonna like the money that comes along with it. And with tobacco farming, we're going to find that it's expansive, it destroys the soil, so you need a lot of land. You can plant the stuff, and then, you know, I don't know how many seasons you have on it, but they're not doing like a rotation in their crop, so the soil is going to be depleted of its nutrients fairly quickly, and so they're going to continue to move westward. And then with all the addition of just people coming into the area as well. So remember we talked about the idea of westward migration. So we're not talking manifest destiny quite at this point, but there is definitely this belief that as Europeans that they have the right to continue to spread westward, and of course this is going to put them in conflict with the native peoples. So even though the Powhatans eventually will become quote-unquote extinct, there's going to be other tribes and groups that the colonists of the region are going to have to deal with. And again, it's the same story every time, that you're going to have basically the natives, the Europeans conflicting, and the Europeans will always come out on top for the most part, and the Indians will either have to continue to move westward out of the way, or because of diseases and the fact that they don't really have any land, they are also, in addition to moving westward, they also will, many of them will just become extinct. Got that? I couldn't get that one out. I hate that. Very importantly, though, because of tobacco farming and the fact that you need a lot of land, is this idea that you need a large supply of labor. So we looked at the idea of indentured servitude, and that was the way, especially at the beginning, that these tobacco planters are going to get their source of labor. Let's move back over there. So looking at indentured servitude then for a minute. Because of the head right system, people who brought others over got more land. So, you know, not only was it an enticing thing for the indentured servants to be able to come over where their passage is being paid, they're going to have basically a place to stay. Yeah, I mean, they're selling themselves into, you know, about 7 years of servitude or whatnot, but they are promised that land at the end, so that's enticing for them. But it's also enticing for the planters to bring these people over, because with that head right system put in place, the more people you bring over, the more land you get. So, you know, that was one thing that just brought a lot of people over. And we talked about how that population growth, right here, how that population growth was not due to natural reproduction. Remember, it's not even until 1619 where you have women coming into the colony. So it's not natural reproduction. It's actually going to be because you have this huge influx of indentured servants that are coming into Jamestown, and then just the whole Chesapeake area as a whole. And then again, just don't mess it up that during this early period that slavery was not the dominant form of labor. That doesn't come until later. We'll talk about a big old rebellion called Bacon's Rebellion, where you're going to start to see the reasons for the switch from indentured servitude into using what's called chattel slavery, which is a slavery you guys are familiar with. But it takes a while for that process to happen. And slavery during this time was really expensive. It wasn't like, you know, people had tons of extra money to spend. You know, I said that Jamestown for a long time was pretty much a failure. So it's going to take a while for people to mass wealth within the area. But man, when they do, they be blinging. This, by the way, this document that you have over here, this is an actual indentured servitude contract. I mean, you can't really read it, but it's that contract between the planter and the indentured servant that basically says that the planter will provide a place for this person to live. They'll be in service for however many years. Again, usually it was somewhere around 7 years. That the planter was supposed to provide land at the end, and then they both sign it and they do their thing, and then hopefully in 7 years everything works out. But as the story goes, and I'm sure you guys get it, that it's not always going to turn out that way, where the servants got what they were promised. In fact, most of them didn't even survive the 7 years that they were actually in servitude, just because the conditions there was really difficult. What we got next? Okay, so also in the Chesapeake area, and this starts in Virginia, you have this idea of representative assemblies. So we talked about how the English, when they came to the colonies, that they totally believed that all of the rights as English people came along with them. The ideas of life and liberty and property, and really importantly for this time period, the idea of representation, that the government can't impose taxes without representation, which comes out of the Magna Carta. So because they felt they didn't have political representation within Parliament back in England, they do set up their own representative assemblies. They were called the Houses of Burgesses. So again, a burgess is a representative, so House of Representatives. That should probably sound kind of familiar. Even though the burgesses had some level of autonomy, understand also that the laws that they could produce, the legislation, it theoretically could be vetoed by London, but like I said earlier, I'm not sure how much that vetoing was actually going on, because it was really difficult for England to have any real semblance of real direct control over the colonies. Oh, lordy lordy. I should give extra credit to any guy who comes to school dressed like that. Like, how awesome is that? What the heck is that? It's like he's wearing like a pincushion or something. I don't know what that is. Anyways, he doesn't look very imposing. So that's James the First. And no, I'm not going to give you extra credit for coming dressed like that. So that's James the First. And so I said James didn't necessarily really like the Virginia colony, because here you have these colonists, they're starting to make some money. They have this level of autonomy with their houses of burgesses. He hates tobacco, morally speaking, so he wants that control. And I think, again, a lot of this idea of control, it goes back to the theory of mercantilism. The main goal of the colonies is simple. It's just to make money for England. It's not about to enrich the colonists. So he wants more control over the situation, and so he revokes the charter, because the colony wasn't doing what he wanted it to do. And the Indian situation also is something that disturbed him. So he wanted to have that more direct control over the colonies. So the Virginia colony, its charter that was given to the Virginia Company, was taken away, revoked in 1624. And then very significantly, Virginia becomes England's first royal colony. And I think I had told you guys that at some point in time, all of the colonies are going to become royal colonies. And the reason for that is simple, because England wanted to have more control over all of their colonies. Again, it's about mercantilism. It's about that direct control that they wanted. So some of the colonies were started off as charter colonies, and the charter colonies had more autonomy than any other type of colony. We have what we're called proprietary colonies, which we'll look at on another day, but basically you have like a business type of a person that is going to run the colony, and then you have the royal colonies, which are basically directed by, as best they could, by the crown. So that's a little bit about Virginia, and we'll talk more about Virginia because Virginia is part of the South, and so is Maryland, but Virginia and Maryland are considered the two Chesapeake colonies because they are on the Chesapeake Bay. Lots of similarities between Virginia and Maryland. So Maryland was founded by a guy named Lord Baltimore. Now, one of the things kind of interesting about Baltimore was that, and I believe his real name was like George Calvert, by the way, if you see that. So Baltimore was a Catholic, and the king at this time is going to be Charles I, who was a Catholic sympathizer. So he's going to give this colony to Lord Baltimore. Lord Baltimore is going to be the proprietor. So like I said, he's kind of like the head businessman of this colony. So Baltimore comes over, he establishes this colony. It's Baltimore that is going to like appoint who the royal, or not royal, who the governor is going to be, and have that more like direct power over the colony versus the crown or the people. So Baltimore is kind of like the head of the colony, if you want to look like that, but it's a business venture. Okay, so like a proprietor, if you're a proprietor, you're a business owner. So that's what Baltimore was. But this obviously implies then that the colony is going to be for profit and to make Baltimore money. And I guarantee you that there were laws that stipulated that so much of that profit also needed to go to England. So the profit part is there. Okay, there's the mercantilism. But because Baltimore is Catholic, there's also an interesting aspect because Catholics were being persecuted in many places, like in England, for instance. You know, England was Protestant, so Catholicism is not Protestant. So the king at the time, luckily for the Catholics, was Charles I. But these people who were Catholics in England, it was a tough time for some of them. So Baltimore, as a Catholic, wanted to, in addition to making money, wanted to establish a colony where Catholics could go and have kind of like a safe haven. So that's an interesting aspect of Maryland, and this idea of religious toleration and separation of church and state. That's huge. When you look at the development of our country, the United States of America, that is a huge proponent of what we believe in. Virginia also will believe in this idea of separation of church and state eventually. But Maryland, they set up this colony as kind of an area where if you believe something different that was not Protestant necessarily, that you had a safe place to go, you didn't have to worry about persecution, and that there wasn't going to be like an established church for the area. So that's really interesting about Maryland, because this idea of religious toleration, like I said, that people have the freedom to believe what they want. It's a basic aspect of who we are as Americans. And do take that with a grain of salt, by the way, because as we're going to see, it's not going to be complete religious toleration. And I think that'll be on the next slide. If not, I'll come back. What else? So like I said, every colony eventually will become a royal colony, so that includes Maryland as well. Oops. There we go. Okay, here's the religious toleration slide. I'll go back to the other slide in a minute, but since I'm talking about religious toleration, let's go ahead and finish that off. So Maryland then set up as kind of for one reason, in addition to profit, is to provide a place for Catholics, but not a ton of Catholics are coming for whatever reason. There wasn't like a ton of them. But very significantly, Maryland is going to establish this Act of Toleration in 1649 that really sets down this foundation of separation of church and state, and that people have the right to worship. But like I said, take it with a grain of salt, because we're not looking at complete freedom of worship. Basically, all Christians that believe in the Holy Trinity. That's it. So, like, that doesn't include Jews, by the way. So, Jews aren't included in that. Of course, Muslims aren't included in that. Buddhists. I don't know how many Buddhists were in the colonies at the time. Probably 0. But, you never know. So, basically, we're talking about Christians. Any practicing Christian religion would have religious toleration. Okay. So again, looking at Virginia, like I said, eventually, and Thomas Jefferson is going to be the leading proponent of this idea of separation of church and state and religious freedoms within Virginia, but initially Virginia is going to make the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, the official church of the colony. So Maryland will attract some radical Protestants because of this act of toleration. So the Puritans will come there, and then there's another group called the Quakers, which we'll look at on another day. And it's not the Quackers. Okay, they're not quacking. No, it's the Quakers. They quake. And I'm not sure how that differs from the Shakers who shake. I'm not really sure. So we'll talk about them on another day. Yep, let me go back to this slide. So what are some characteristics of the Maryland colony? So it's going to be kind of similar to Virginia. So we're looking at planter class, merchant class type people. Again, you have this headright system in Maryland like you had in Virginia. So you've got a lot of people coming in, indentured servants. They're on the bottom. You got aristocrats coming down from Virginia. So, or I guess not down, kind of up. So they're going, some of the Virginians may be looking for more land, or they like the idea of the religious toleration or whatever. Some of them are going to be going to Virginia. In Maryland, we're going to see, and in Virginia as well, you're not going to have these like massive plantations that some of you guys may be familiar with that come later. So we're looking at smaller tracts of land. That means some of these are still going to be pretty big plantations, but not like what we're going to see in the Deep South. It's very prosperous. Again, it's a tobacco colony, just like Virginia was. Plantation, again, in terms of labor, we're looking at indentured servants. All right. If we're looking at the political aspects of the Chesapeake region, and this is going to hold true pretty much for the entire South, most of these points. This is a kind of an interesting point here when we're looking at the people that are coming to America and establishing these colonies. They don't tend to be the aristocracy of England. I mean, think about it. If you were aristocracy in England and you were already like, you know, on top of society, why would you come here? Because you would most likely, chances maybe, that you would lose that position. So what's really interesting about this is that the people who come over tend to be a little bit more the middling classes and stuff. Now they're on top of society, so they're kind of new to power. And like the lower classes that are there, they don't respect these people of new power. So the deference is not given to the upper planter classes by the lower classes. So there's not that respect. Like back in England, the lower classes automatically accepted and respected the aristocracy because that's how their society was. They were born into that position. Here in the Americas, they just kind of fell into that position. It was more of a money thing. So it wasn't like they were born there. They weren't quote unquote true aristocracy. So it's going to be hard for these wealthier people in the colonies to have any real power initially because the lower classes aren't really going to respect that. And I can tell you also that the aristocracy and government in England had zero respect for the planter class in the colonies. And we're going to find later that, you know, people that you're familiar with, like John Adams and George Washington and Jefferson, you know, they're considered the aristocracy here in the Americas, but you know, in England, they look down upon them because they're not true blue bloods born into those positions. Now, obviously, things will change over time because the aristocracy in the Americas eventually will have power, but that doesn't come really until you have the adoption of African slave labor. And the reason for that's pretty simple is that with African slave labor, whites don't want to be equated with blacks. And so whites, they all kind of come together and they unify with each other regardless if you were the lowest of the low or the highest of the high, because no one wanted to be a black African slave. So they're unifying together. And the fact of the matter is that the poor people are going to want to be like those big planters who have these big plantations and have all these African slaves. and whatnot. So when we have this development of slave labor here in the Americas, that's when you start to see the lower classes saying, all right, we get it, you guys are the planter class, we want to be like you, let's unify together against the African class, the African slaves. Again, very significantly, politically speaking, is the idea of taxes, going back to the Magna Carta, that they have this belief that you cannot tax without representation. That's why the House of Burgesses was established, because they thought that they didn't have representation in Parliament. Of course, England's going to think differently. We'll talk about that on another day. And then landowners, when it comes to things like voting and having some type of political power within the colonies, probably the most important factor in that is going to be land owning. For a very long time in not just the colonies, but also in our country after the Constitution, that you have to be a landowner to vote. And the style of government you see in the South is going to be more of a county style government, and that'll be opposed to like more of the small towns governments and city governments that you're going to see in the middle colonies and the New England colonies. Because the South is going to be big, it's going to be expansive. You don't have a development of a lot of cities in the South, so you have these bigger forms of government. So county government will be the predominant governmental system within the Chesapeake and within the South. Keep hitting the wrong button. So looking at the influence of the West Indies and the development of the southern colonies, so down in the West Indies or the Caribbean, the English had been there already for a while, like Barbados in particular, and they, like the Spanish before them, had been planting sugar on these plantations, and they're already using African slaves there. So the influence is going to be very, very significant. So on Barbados, it's the first English colony with a slave majority. So that's going to scare the heebie-jeebies out of the English planters there, because the slaves are going to have power in numbers. So the English feel they have to control any type of a rebellion. So they're going to have to codify some laws to establish that African slaves are they have no rights. They're basically property. So this comes with the Barbados Slave Codes of 1661, which you absolutely need to remember. Right? So Barbados Slave Codes is the first time the British are going to codify or write down laws dealing with slaves. And essentially, again, what they do is they state that slaves have zero political rights. They're basically like animals. Like they call it chattel slavery. It's like they're in chains. They're like animals. From my understanding, the Barbados slave codes were also to try to protect the African slaves, but I mean, there's really nothing in there protection. It allowed the slave owners to maim, beat, kill their slaves if they had to. They had no rights. They had no civil liberties. And again, you look at why. Why would they do this? Why would they create this? Again, a lot of it has to do with this idea that there was a slave majority, and there was this fear that the African slaves would potentially rebel against the British colonists on Barbados. So this is a policy completely based on fear. And we're going to see this time and time again. I mean, this shouldn't shock you. What's going to happen is this is going to be transplanted into the American colonies. So this is where that idea comes from. So these Barbados slave codes. So what happens on Barbados? It's a small island. Eventually they're going to run out of room. Land becomes scarce. It's going to be harder to actually make a profit because the competition is going to be so great. So you're going to have some of the English Barbados planters move. They're going to migrate from the Barbados into the Carolinas. So the Carolinas would be South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia. And again, so significantly, they're bringing those slave codes, that Barbados slave code with them. So when slavery starts in the Carolinas, then we're going to see that they automatically aren't going to have any political or civil rights whatsoever. So let's look at the Carolinas a little bit. Again, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. So the king at this time, and by the way, you never really need to know who these kings are. You don't have to memorize that at all. So at this time is Charles II. And Charles II, he wanted to reward some of his friends for helping him out. So he is going to give this territory to his friends in 1670, and it's these people then who set up these territories in the Carolinas that are going to allow the Barbados planters to come into the area and go ahead and establish plantation-style agriculture. Kind of interesting within the Carolinas is they had some semblance of religious toleration at first, political representation, so they probably had their own forms of like houses of burgesses. We'll see about that. And then also to entice people to come to the Carolinas, you have this thing called exemption from quit rents. I don't think you really need to know this, but basically a quit rent, it was a tax on land for the most part. So if this was exempt, it means you didn't have to pay it. So it was to entice you to come. It's like, look, we have a head right system. You don't have to pay taxes on this land. It's just a way to get people to come to the area. And the land grants were actually a lot larger than like in Maryland or in Virginia. So the acreage is going to be pretty big. And we're going to see the establishment of the plantations in this area is going to be much bigger than it was, say, in Virginia or in Maryland. So a lot of the colonists then coming to the Carolinas are from the West Indies. Some are going to come down from the Chesapeake. A bunch of indentured servants, a third of the population. So we're still looking at indentured servants being the predominant source of labor and a huge chunk of the population just in general. So you've got, this is kind of an important thing, is this idea that the people, the planters within what will become the Deep South, these are your really big plantations that you've seen, if you've ever seen like Gone with the Wind, for instance. These massive plantations with the big house, that's the big house right here, and you got like all the slave quarters, and you've got hundreds of slaves in some cases. So you're not going to see that really so much like in Maryland and Virginia and even in North Carolina, but the more south you get, you have these huge plantations, very aristocratic, lots and lots of wealth within the region. Again, Indians, again, kind of same old story. There is a fear, kind of interesting, fear of alliance between Indians and slaves, because you will have quite a bit of slaves within the region because they're being brought up from Barbados. So you have this fear of alliance between the Indians and the slaves. The planters try to get on the good side of the Indians. They give them blankets and they give them booze and food and stuff like that. Hey, we're awesome, come and work with us. So the Indians at first will be slave catchers, but because of disease, because a lot of them will succumb to alcoholism and raids from other Indian groups, that they too will be decimated in the region by about 1710 or so. When they're gone, more land open for colonial development, so more people coming in. A lot of the Indians in the area also are going to migrate to Pennsylvania. So you've got this huge influx of Europeans coming in. Either you're dying because of disease, you're a drunk, or you're killed from other Indian raids. So it wasn't really, for the Indians, this area obviously is not going to be that conducive to their livelihood. So some of them will migrate into Pennsylvania. And we're going to find that Pennsylvania was very tolerant towards Native American Indians. So I talked a little bit about the beginnings of racism with slaves. When slaves first came, like in 1619, when the Dutch brought them, again, it wasn't their skin color that they were discriminated against so much. It was the fact that they were not Christians. So when you start to have more and more slaves coming into the area, there's this thought that you have to control them. And so that's where you begin to see this kind of switch. That's not the Christianism, the fact that they're not Christians, whatever it is. It's basically that the Europeans feel that they need some sense of control, and since they're black and we're white, we are superior, you are inferior, we have rights, you have no rights. And then, like I said, all of whites are going to begin to establish the idea of racial solidarity. Even the lowest of the low whites will begin to buy into this idea, because they don't want to be on the bottom of society. When you have slavery, you always have somebody below you, socially speaking. So even the lowest of the low began to, with the planter class, began to buy into this idea of racism, basically a way to elevate them in terms of social status. So wealth and power become somewhat secondary when it comes to who is superior and who is inferior, and so you have this idea of black and white, good and not good, superior, inferior. So this is where you see the beginnings of that cultural white superiority, when you begin to have more slaves coming in, especially into those lower southern colonies like South Carolina and then eventually Georgia. Some new crops in addition to tobacco. Oh, this is like really important, and I get this every now and then. Kids will forget this. This early on in our history, the predominant crop, the big cash crop, is tobacco. Tobacco is king, okay, during this period. It's not cotton. Cotton was not grown at this time yet. That doesn't come until later. Don't mess that up, okay? Also in the South, you're going to have rice that is going to be grown. It's one of the big cash crops that they have, and this is going to bring more African slaves into the area because they need the labor, for one, and then secondly, Africans grew rice in Africa in a lot of areas, so they had that knowledge of how to grow rice already, so that was helpful to the planters. So by 1700, slaves are a majority. Again, you got to have more codes because the whites feel that it's very possible that the slaves, because they have more numbers, that they'll be able to overrun them. So you got to impose codes. You have to take their rights away from them and all of that. Indigo is another crop. It's basically a dye. It's like a blue dye. I guess that was popular with like for different cloth, like dresses and things like that. So the South, as I mentioned earlier, didn't develop very many cities. It was more of a plantation. Plantations themselves were kind of like cities unto themselves. Charlestown or Charleston is going to be probably the most important southern town that you need to know for this time period. Very busy, lots of trading going on within Charleston. Slavery will become the essence of society within the area. Very, again, wealthy, aristocratic area. So Carolina at one point was Carolina. Okay, like I said, it included North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So you have these rich people, these landed aristocrats, that are going to completely take over the southern part of the Carolinas, and they begin to change things up a bit. No religious toleration. The Church of England, or the Anglican Church, is the official church. If you're not an Anglican, you can't hold office. Eventually it'll become a royal colony, and it's these really wealthy planters that dominate political, social, economic aspects of this area. Well, some people are like, I don't want to live like that. I don't necessarily want to be part of the church. I value this idea of a separation of church and state. I want more autonomy. I don't want to be in a royal colony. So the great planters will take over South Carolina, and then what I have here, the misfits. So those people who don't really fit into that mold, they begin to move north to start their own colony, and so that'll be North Carolina. So you'll have then a division between North and South Carolina that will officially happen in 1719. So North Carolina then, we're looking at very different than South Carolina, okay? And it's going to be very different from Georgia as well. So North Carolina, we're looking at smaller tobacco farms. You don't really have the big slave labor. You don't have these huge plantations. You have people who are more open-minded, people who more have this spirit of resistance to authority. They're more independent, democratic. They're not as aristocratic. So these are kind of like, again, it's your misfits. It's the people who don't fit into this mold that they had created in South Carolina. Now, when we talk about Rhode Island on another day, we'll see that North Carolina and Rhode Island are going to be very similar in terms of the makeup of their population. Now, Georgia's really interesting to look at. So Georgia was started out as a royal colony, and it was started as an experiment kind of for social reform. One of the things that the guy who started this colony, James Oglethorpe, wanted to do is he wanted to bring people who were in jail for debt. They had debtor's prison in England. You can't pay your bills, you go to jail. So instead of having these people in jail sitting idle doing nothing, why don't you have them come to the colonies and have them work? So that's one of the things that Oglethorpe wanted to do, and the Crown was receptive to this idea, so they got a charter to do this. Another thing that was beneficial about having Georgia was it served as a buffer colony, because on the, let's see if I get my directions right, so Georgia. So on the west side of Georgia is going to be the Louisiana Territory, which is going to be controlled by the French. And then to the east and south of Georgia is going to be Spanish Florida. So you've got two different countries who control colonies right there. So Georgia can kind of serve as a buffer for that. It's also the first tax-supported colony, and I think that the government's really going to like that. I think it's one of the reasons why they want to turn a lot of the colonies into royal colonies so they can collect taxes, which is going to be a problem because, again, the people believe that you can't have taxation without representation. So they don't think they have representatives in Parliament. So this is what is going to lead to a lot of problems, which eventually leads to the Revolution and our independence. What else? It's the last of 13 colonies. The last of the 13 colonies. So that's Georgia. Now, this is probably going to shock you. In Georgia, Oglethorpe initially is going to say no slavery. Okay? And one of the biggest reasons for that is because Spanish Florida had banned slavery. And they actually enticed slaves in the British colonies to come to Florida. They said, look, you come to Florida, we give you your freedom. So, of course, the Georgian colonies government is going to be a little scared about that you're going to have all these runaway slaves going to Spanish Florida, which is going to weaken the economy. So, no slavery. So, initially, in Georgia, no slavery, and because of that, you don't have these massive plantations that you saw or see within South Carolina. Things are going to change, though, because people are like, I want me slaves. All right, so one of the things is that the economy, it didn't do very well within Georgia under this system. All right, and there were other regulations that people didn't like as well. You couldn't have slaves. You couldn't have booze. No lawyers. I don't know if that's a bad thing or not, but no lawyers and no elected assemblies. So the people living in Georgia were kind of like, wait a minute, this is pretty whack. We don't like this. We think it's too dictatorial. So they're saying we want to change things. And this is interesting. This is that rebellious American spirit. I think it's part of who we are as a people here. We believe we have rights. And if we think our rights are being violated, what do? We stand up and we rebel. So the people, the settlers, colonists of Georgia, they say they want liberty. They want property without restrictions. They want to be able to have slaves so they could make money. They believe that plantation style of agriculture, which was so successful in South Carolina, they want to do the same thing. So some of the restrictions were lifted. The trustees, which included Oglethorpe, are going to give the colony to the Crown, so it becomes a royal colony now. And so what happens is that this colony then will be established into the same type of colony that we see in South Carolina. It's a plantation, agriculture type of a colony, and you have this huge planter elite, big aristocracy, just like in South Carolina. So then that brings us to the end of this, and one of the things you really need to be able to do, the College Board loves to give questions on the similarities and differences between all of the colonies. So you should be able to know what are the shared characteristics of the South and the Chesapeake. All right, so some of those shared characteristics are going to be exportation of commercial agricultural products. So we're looking at staple crops like rice and tobacco are going to be the big ones. You have most of the southern colonies will eventually be based upon slavery. They're very aristocratic. No major cities except for like Charleston, and they're extremely expansionary. Very, very expansionary. So that is that. Whoa. Hey! Well, I think there's someone at her door. I don't know if you still hear her barking. She did look cute right off the bat, though, didn't she? Sometimes my dog Abby will make an appearance in my videos. I guess that's going to be her appearance for this lovely video right here. Hold on. Get it. Oh. Get it, girl. Get it. Get it. Get it. Get it. Arr. Ow! Arr. Je pipidi. Why isn't this working? Get it, girl. Get it. Get it, girl. Get it. What is happening there? Hello. Technical difficulties.